Welcome to Parent Coaches Unleashed, the podcast where we dive into the highs, lows, and did that really just happen moment of parenting teens and young adults. We're Carrie and Jessica, parent coaches, mythbusters, and occasional referees in the battle of hormones versus common sense.
If you've ever wondered, is this just happening to me? You're not alone. We're here to help you with real talk, expert advice, and hopefully a few laughs along the way. Need more support? We also offer private coaching, workshops, and speaking engagements because sometimes even parents don't have all the answers.
So continue listening as we tackle this parenting journey together.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode. We have a really interesting show for you today. Today's guest actually came about after Carrie and I spoke with a high school English teacher who shared with us that there are some serious issues surrounding teens and online gambling and sports betting. So Carrie and I wanted to learn more about this, and we wanted to make our listeners more aware of what's going on and the possible ramifications of these actions.
Right. And so in our search to find an expert to help educate our listeners, not saying, oh my God, your child has an issue, but how do you talk about these serious topics with your children? We are lucky to have found Ryan Soave. He is a licensed mental health counselor and the chief clinical officer at Guardian Recovery. So welcome, Ryan. We are so honored to have you.
Thank you. I'm grateful and honored to be here as well.
And if you could just give us a little bit of background about you and what your current role is so people listening understand why. We know why you're the expert, but so if you could just share a little bit, that'd be great.
Of course. As you said, I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Florida. I've been in the field for 15 or 16 years. I came in it as a practitioner as I became a therapist, and over the years have really specialized in working with people with substance use and alcohol use disorders, but also process addictions, other types of addictions, which gambling will fall under, and really with the trauma and mental health that's underlying whatever the behaviors are. You know, the behaviors that people show, we often call that their pathology, is often not really the problem. It's something that's becomes problematic, but it's usually the solution to something else. You know, there's a level of anxiety or stress that they're using the substance or the process or something, another behavior to medicate. And, you know, we need to help people with those behaviors and coping mechanisms that are negative for them. But if you don't really get to what's underlying it, what's driving them, what's causing the stress that they're looking for relief from, then, you know, we just kind of get people in a revolving door. So I've worked with people in, you know, different populations. My role at Guardian Recovery, I'm the chief clinical officer. We're a national behavioral health network. We have facilities in 6 states, about 19 locations. We treat primarily adults with substance use disorders and alcohol use disorders, with also co-occurring mental health disorders. And then we also specialize in treating adolescents as well. So that's how I came about to see you guys. We've been working with adolescents for a few years. I also was an adolescent. I'm the parent of adolescent and a couple kids that are becoming adolescents. So I'm in it from a lot of different angles.
I was going to say you're coming from all of the angles, which we are super grateful to have you here today. So we're going to jump right in with our questions because we have so many.
Ryan, when Carrie and I first spoke with our guest, literally our jaws dropped. Like we were so surprised. We thought maybe she would say the biggest issues she's facing is bullying or maybe vaping.
Yeah.
Right. And to hear her say gambling, but yet when you and I spoke initially, you didn't seem all that surprised.
Not at all.
Can you tell why? What are you seeing with teens?
Well, I mean, we're seeing all of that other stuff as a challenge as well. I mean, there's
Sure.
bullying, there's a lot of substance use, there's a lot of, you know, issues with vaping, like you said, alcohol, you know, the really dangerous stuff with drugs these days where, you know, fentanyl being involved, where, you know, somebody who's just experimenting could end up, you know, incapacitated or pass away. It's a dangerous world out there for kids just, maybe that don't have a diagnosable use disorder or would be called an addict, but, just kind of like, I don't know your ages, but I grew up in the, 80s and 90s and
We're older than you.
older than maybe a little bit in the
Not
70s.
much.
But, not that that stuff was not that it was okay that people were using drugs and alcohol then, but it was a little less, the marijuana is much more potent now. There's much more available. The internet makes it very easy to get these things that were harder to get in the past. And the delivery methods are different. I mean, they don't have to roll a joint and go behind the school and sneak out. They've got vapes all day long.
Right.
Right.
They're
The
just
bathrooms are a huge issue in
yeah,
schools.
it's a huge thing.
Right, and a lot of the behaviors, don't you feel, go undetected,
Yeah.
right? Like, the parents, teachers aren't seeing these things.
Some of it's because, they're not educated as what to see. Some of it is, a lot of the kids are doing it. And, some of it is, some parents aren't paying attention, and maybe it's because they're just not aware of what to look for, which is one of the things we really try to help with.
Let's just talk about that for a second because talking to some of our listeners, a lot of people did not see an immediate issue with their kids going on some of these gambling sites. Some parents even sign on for their kids and give their kids access to their bank account. So, is there a line and how do you know when somebody crosses over it from just having fun and experimenting to something is seriously wrong here? I need to get my child's help.
Yeah. So, I mean, the word addiction isn't really a psychological, it's not really a diagnosable. You don't diagnose addiction. We have like substance use disorders and alcohol use disorders. And, we have issues, gambling disorder. We have issues with like eating, we can diagnose eating disorders. And let's just take one of like a substance use disorder at first. I just want to make a quick distinction here. We can actually, as professionals with training, you know, psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists, we can look at a person and getting a history and look at a set of biological, psychological, and social um, criteria and see, if they fit one of these diagnoses for a use disorder, which could be anywhere from mild to severe and could go to dependence. With a drug or alcohol, they could actually be depending on it to be able to they're physically depending on it in order to get through the day. But we can look at these factors and understand, that this person and diagnose that this person has a use disorder and we can treat it. Biologically, we're going to look at, how is the use impacting their physical body, from any sort of medical complications to how their sleep, their ability to function at all, psychological from their ability to concentrate or not, what if they're falling into depression or anxiety or symptoms of those things. Um, and socially, what's the impact that it's having on their world? What's the impact that it's having on their ability to participate with friend groups? If it's an adult, go to work, be in relationships, and when we can look at these different factors, we can put it all together and say, this person really needs some help, and we can help them see that they need some help, that people don't always see it and family members don't always see it. It's not something that we want to see one of our loved ones have. And it would be much easier if it was a medical complication versus some behavior that they're doing. It still has a lot of stigma to it. And when we get to things like, as I started to say in the beginning, when and I will use the term addiction. I just wanted to make that distinction. But when someone is addicted to something, whatever they're addicted to is, as I said, not really the problem. It's the medication that they're using to solve some sort of underlying stressor that they're experiencing. And for all humans, I believe, when we experience enough stress, we're going to look for relief. And if we experience a high amount of stress, wherever that's coming from, and we're living with a chronic type of stress, then the relief that we're going to look for is something that will relieve that type of high intensity stress. So, sometimes, we know that if you can meditate or do some breath work or something like that, it's going to make you better over time. You're going to function better. You're going to be able to concentrate. But if you're living in a really high intense state of stress, it's not going to do much in that moment. A friend of mine used to say, 3 martinis works a lot faster than a prayer. but it doesn't work long and it doesn't work well. We're looking for that relief to feel better, and when we look at something like gambling, which we can, there's a gambling disorder, but I think with kids, it can really fall as part of an impulse disorder. They're looking at, something that gives them a sense of uh, feeling okay, and there's a dopamine hit when you win. Sometimes there's a dopamine hit when they lose. You can look at, if I make this money, then I'm going to be able to do these things with my friends and I'm going to be able to be free. There's all of this kind of fantasizing that goes along with it. And, I think Jessica and I talked about this on the phone. I look at gambling as probably one of the only addictions where the next thing, the next kind of hit, if you will, can solve all the problems. If you lost a bunch of money, you might win it all back. Nobody really thinks, I think nobody that really struggles with alcohol or a drug really thinks that this next one is going to make it better over time. It's just going to make me it's going to make me feel better right now. And so it can, when you feel that sense of winning, or that there's a solution of some sort, then it can quell that level of stress or anxiety, and then it's a repetitive behavior that people can get into and they can kind of check out and not really think about the things that are going on that might be causing them anxieties or causing them stress or the depression that they're. How do we know when it becomes a problem? I mean,
Yeah.
simply put, it becomes a problem when there's problems,
So
and
maybe for a kid, bad grades or missed assignments or being late for school all the time or staying up all night and miss sleep or
yeah,
maybe not participate. Yeah,
their
friend
friend group
group.
becomes really small. Their life becomes really small. They're not really motivated to do anything else that maybe they've been motivated to do before. They're isolating. There's a lot that can go on there. And I kind of made a joke by saying it's a problem when it's a problem, but we'd like to identify this before it's that big problem
Right.
that they're going down that road. And a kid is different than an adult in that their brain is still developing. There's a lot, in it from a psychological healing perspective, that can be great too, because it might not, it might not get wound up as much as an adult and having years and years and years of shame and guilt that builds up or the patterns of behavior, but it can also become a problem much quicker. They can much, much quicker. And if their parent, they may not have access to the amount of money that an adult would have. So maybe it doesn't look like they're losing and not being able to pay their mortgage. Maybe they are only gambling the amount that their parents are giving them. But what are the other things going on in their life that aren't having them be able to, meet their, not just the goals that their parents have or society has, but their own goals? Kids aren't really built to be stuck in their room and not being social. I mean, there's a whole epidemic of that, and things like gambling are gonna, gambling and video games and things like that are gonna, they don't make it better. And that doesn't mean that everybody that gambles has a problem. It doesn't mean that everybody plays a video game that has a problem, just like everybody that drinks doesn't have a problem. But we have to look at the whole person and really understand what's going on with them such that, you know, their parents are reaching out for help or they see that there might be an issue coming down the road.
So, full disclosure here, my brother had a gambling addiction or a gambling disorder. I've been very open and honest with my kids that we have. I actually don't know if this is correct or not. So, Ryan, please jump in. But I tell them that there's addiction in our family, that you might have a precursor for it. I don't know. I just want them to be aware that there might come a time when they can't turn it off, when they can't say no. Because I know my son is a sophomore in college, and I know that he plays poker with his friends. I know that my boys and my husband, and Carrie and I as well, we were in fantasy football leagues. I guess what I want to know is, are some people missing that off switch, or is it more what the underlying issues are that are causing them to go further and further and not be able. I guess what I'm saying, like what you said, is it the underlying issues that have not been addressed that are causing them to continue down this path?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I'm not gonna be able to quote the studies, but I mean, there's been a lot of work done to show, especially when it looks at like alcoholism, that there's kind of it can kind of seem to get passed down through generations. Sometimes it skips it. Maybe the person rebels against it and never drinks, and the next generation drinks a lot. But I think that there's a real convergence at some point of kind of the nature versus nurture, especially when we look at not just genetics, but epigenetics, which is really kind of the study of the system in the environment that people grow up in. And I used to travel to China for work. And when I would go, I remember being in an airport once and I smelled something, and it was like one of the most disgusting smells I've ever smelled. And like, I didn't have hair in my head then, but the hair on my back of my neck and I guess my beard was
If you
staying.
had hair, it would have stood
It
up.
did have hair. If I did have hair, it would have stared. And, I was like, what is that? And I looked over and it was a family with kids eating a snack, which turned out to be some dried fish out of a bag. And to me, it smelled putrid and something that I would run away from. And they were enjoying it like candy. And what I take from that is that like taste and the foods that we eat are informed by the families we grow up in, the environments that we're in. You go to different parts of the world and people eat different things. If taste can be informed like that, why aren't behaviors? And if there's a stressor in a family, it can tend to get passed down. We tend to like adopt or rebel against the patterns of our parents. Not necessarily that all of them are bad, but to understand that, you know, a challenge in life came up and I saw my dad deal with it like this, or my mom deal with it like this, or not deal with it like this, and then I may adopt that same way of maybe shying away from a problem or doing everything I can to control it, and either both of those things I'm kind of driven by the history or the environment that I grew up with, and not being able to see the problem or challenge that I'm dealing with as it is. I'm really seeing the problem or challenge as I am, or as I was, or as my family was. So I think that the how we deal with stressors, how we deal with things that might be like symptoms of anxiety or depression, or it could just be worry and sadness. It doesn't have to be a diagnosable mental health condition. Those are the things that are passed down. And, we learn from the environments that we're in. Does that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So I
So,
think it's a little bit of both, to understand what are the underlying stressors that we carry. Where is it that I look for relief? Am I able to stop? If alcohol, if someone's problem that's drinking alcohol was just alcohol, if that was it, all they need to do is stop drinking and then they get better. The thing is, most people, when they stop drinking, if they've been drinking to a point where they need some sort of treatment for it, or they need to go to detox and then residential treatment, it, the their lives don't get better right away. They get worse, at least emotionally. Better, they might be able to sleep. They might be able to be clear in the head. They're not getting arrested. They're not getting in, huge. But emotionally, they've lost the medicine that calmed the stress that they had.
Like that made them feel better.
Right. And that's why we see people that they stop and then they go back to it. Same with something like, with gambling or any other sort of thing or process that we can get, that we become impulsive around, and what we could say we become addicted to.
but what happens? Like, I'm gonna just talk about where we live in South Florida, and, you know, middle class to upper class, people have money, kids are seeing, access to money, right? They can use Apple Pay, or they can use their parents' credit card, or maybe they have a credit card. And all of their friends are able to do similar things. So to them, it looks normal that, oh, Joe is, placing a sports bet or on FanDuel or whatever the sites are. And so has become like normalized, and it feels like it's just getting like the kids are getting younger and younger that are able to do this or doing this. So, what would you say to parents who aren't necessarily seeing it like as a problem because the kid yet hasn't withdrawn from their friend groups because they want to be with their friends more because they're doing it? Or maybe my parents said I couldn't, so I'm going to go over to Johnny's house because he has access and we're going to place bets together. But I guess I'm just looking for some guidance, or how do we open parents' eyes that, like, it might not be normal, or what are the red flags of it's no longer normal or healthy, or how to talk to their kids like, "This is what you might be doing with your friend, but I have some questions for you to gauge how they're really feeling about it." Like, do you have any I know I said a lot.
We're up for if we're allowing them to do that, and there's different levels of participation in those things. We could say that we put kids in sports and we want to compete and we want to win, and there's a lot of healthy components that come to that. But when we're gambling, you're setting up to a game that's set for everybody to lose over time. Show me the casino that's losing money, and they over time they're they always win.
Right.
You know, over time, these kids are going to lose. And what's the amount of time that they're spending doing that? How much is that pulling away from their other activities, the things that maybe it will be nurturing for them to participate in? And then what is the message that we're giving them about how to solve problems, how to make money later in life? I mean, not only are they gambling on like FanDuel, there's websites and these crypto sites where you can bet on anything. You during the presidential election, I remember there was like during debates that you could bet on if how many times they were going to say a certain word. And then there's these online casinos, that are run, who knows where they're hosted, and they're set up for the kid. I think a regular casino is going to make money when they win, 1.5 to 2% of the time. The margins aren't that great for them. But if you're betting on a site that's hosted somewhere in Europe, that's just based on, it's set up like an app on a phone and a game like a Candy Crush, where you're going to keep playing it, and they might have you win a little bit, but that's because they know you're going to keep going. They can learn from you with an algorithm how you're going to play, and then ultimately you're going to lose. And so you're setting these kids up to fail, and at the expense of what? I guess maybe sometimes it's not for me to say that everybody that lets their kid do this is doing something completely terrible. But I mean, I would say there's probably a reason that, we don't allow people to go into casinos until you're a certain age. And that might even be too young. Their brains are developing and the neural pathways are getting set so that this is how they're going to deal with their problems and stressors. And it might not be an issue at first. A lot of people that drink, it's not problematic when they drink at first. But later on, when they are faced with a stressor in life, a relationship ends, they lose a job, life has stressors. That's part of it. And what are they going to turn to? And is this something that we're setting them up to turn to, and to set up that kind of impulsive behavior and thinking that's not going to support them in other areas of their life?
I also think there's something to be said for what we've become as a society, expecting instant gratification.
Well, that too. Yeah, of course. We don't have to struggle.
Right.
I mean, 200 or 300 years ago, there was a lot of, I mean, if you look at, how people lived, they moved around a lot, they walked a lot. I think I read something, a couple hundred years ago, people walked an average of like 12 miles a day, just like moving around. They were carrying things, they had to get their own, you had to struggle to get your food. You had to struggle to make sure you had the right shelter. And I don't mean struggle like it was, they were totally, impoverished and in pain. This was just what life was in the
That was
end.
their survival.
Yeah, they had to work really hard to get it, like, it was a physical.
That allowed the energy to go somewhere. Now, for better or worse, I don't have to go hunt my food. I just have to pull up an app on my phone and press a button and it shows up. And that's great. That's awesome. These modern conveniences are incredible. But am I then taking care of my mind and my body in the way that I normally, maybe as I was built as a human in our evolution, to kind of move through the day, expend the energy that's in my body rather than sit there? And now all that energy that I have in my body is going to my mind, and I'm spending all that time creating anxiety, which then leads to depression because I'm more sedentary than I ever have been. I mean, that's a problem with, I think, society at large, but especially with kids. And then we look for this instant gratification, and instant gratification is not something that's going to happen all of the time with everything in life. In fact, most of the things that we get that we are instantly gratified by don't help us have like long-term happiness at all, you know?
One of the issues, the teacher that we were talking to brought up that their work level has deteriorated because they see a way to earn money quickly. And why do I need school? I can just do this to earn money.
Right, or why do I need a college education? Because I think after high school, I could try ABC to earn, have an income and get famous. Or I mean, I remember when my son was first in college that another student in his dorm just started playing video games all day, all night, and people started streaming him and paying him. I mean, he ended up leaving like a top college to go do this, right? Like, I don't know. I would be really shocked, like, if I was a parent, and but we all have goals for our kids and they have goals for themselves, and then all of a sudden it changes because there's a quick way to make money.
Right, but that kid wasn't a quick way. He worked hard at it, actually.
Okay, so
I'm not, and that's a very small percentage of people that are going to get to that. I mean, if he's a world champion, there's one of them.
right.
It's like athletes that work really hard to get. I mean, most kids that play sports at a young age are not going to be professional athletes, no matter how hard they're working at it. I mean, most people that play at the top levels of college athletes or college athletics are not going to become professional athletes. It's a very small percentage. And I'm not saying that some of them can't get there, but, you know, uh, I'm not suggesting that everybody go out and become a video game champion, but if that kid had to play every day, every night, and then stream it, put all that together and work hard at it, chances are, I'm guessing he wasn't spending all of his time gambling or smoking, pot to do this. Maybe he was, I don't
Maybe
know,
it
but
was, maybe.
maybe he was. He found a way through it. Not every kid needs to go to college. I mean, there's ways that, but there's the most kids that I talk to, including my own, they have goals that they want for their lives about being in relationships and having a family or whatever it is for them. Are they, is what they're doing fitting in with getting them to whatever those goals are for them? Not every kid is probably, maybe you might disagree with me, but not every kid is suited for college, and that's okay.
Yeah.
100%.
Correct, correct. And I don't think that's what we're saying, oh, it has to be one path, but I guess the sign would be when that was the goal and then something suddenly
Yeah,
changes.
so that would be a thing to look at. Like, if there are sudden changes with them, and you touched on this before, but and people are able to change their goals. Sometimes kids are living out the goals of their parents and then they figure something out. But I think something you said is it's not one path, but is there a path? Or are they just kind of stuck on it and hiding out and isolating and not living life?
So what would you say to the parent who needed help because their son or daughter called home from college to say, I have a gambling addiction, I have a problem, I can no longer go to class, I've lost X amount of dollars, I might be on academic probation, please help, please help. What steps do those parents take and where do they go for support and guidance? If it's coming out of left field, like, they had no idea.
Right. So I think that's an opportunity right then, and to seize that opportunity. Because oftentimes the window opens and someone says they need help, and then they stop for a little bit, and it doesn't, we tend to forget about the pain and suffering that they were in even a few days ago, and it doesn't seem that bad anymore. So there's an opportunity there. And first, I just want to say, just because someone says they have a problem and they need help, it's not the end of the world. In fact, this could be the beginning of a new way of them living. And it doesn't mean that they all need to go away for treatment, or they're going to die tomorrow, right? It's not something that needs to be reacted to in a way like there was a severe medical injury that needed to go to the hospital. This is an opportunity to really take account of what's going on and take them up on getting them the help they need, and for the family to get the help they need. Because maybe they didn't see it coming. Maybe if they understood what some of the traits are to look for, maybe they did see it coming. I have that happen all the time, where people are like, "Wow, I just didn't realize, that thought something, I thought, they weren't calling as much, or they weren't, engaged in some of the same things that they used to be, or their friend, they didn't seem as happy when they were home." And this isn't to blame, for the parents to blame themselves. It's just often the case that, hindsight is 2020 and we can look at it. But to get them talking about it with a professional. I mean, that's is a great start. If they're in college, that, most colleges have some sort of student services where there's counselors that they can talk to. And I think in that case, it would be best if if the family could get involved as well and actually talk to the counselor. I mean, if they're an adult, obviously they have to sign a release for them to be involved, but be open with your kids, not to blame them, not to make them wrong for what they're doing, but to really try to understand what's going on that they would get to the point where they called and they needed help, and then get your own help to understand what help is. Because, someone could be calling home and say, I've got a gambling problem. I really need help. And then their solution is, I just need to borrow $10,000 and I'll get this straight and then I'll figure it all out on my own. Well, that might not be money well spent. In fact, I would say it probably isn't at that point, to stop and take account, like I said, for where you are, what are the things that they're experiencing, and get them to be able to talk to somebody to identify, what's going on such that it led them to this place, that they were using gambling in a way that now they're identifying it as a problem.
What happens if the child does not ask for help? What happens if the child does not say they have a problem, but the parents notice that all the money that they put in their bank account for that month is gone within a matter of hours or something like that? And when they confront their child, they say, "No, I don't have a problem. Nothing's going on. I'm fine."
Well, number one, don't put any more money in the bank account. And before you do, we need to have a discussion. And if they're not willing to talk about what led to that, it might not be gambling, it might be something else. But, if all the money's gone in a matter of hours that they put in for the semester, there's something going on. It might not be a deep seated psychological issue, but there's something that they need to talk about. And if their adult child is not able to talk about with them, or isn't willing to, that's when they can seek out some help for themselves and, find out, how do I deal with this? Whether they're working with I mean, it's a great opportunity to work with a parent coach, or a therapist on their own, to be able to, reflect out, to them, like what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and then start looking at what might be the possible ways that we can talk to the person, and or their, I don't want to say their kid because they're in college, but oftentimes that is part of the challenge, that, you know, their son or daughter has grown to be 18, 19, 20 years old, and we're still talking with them and reacting to them as if they were 5, 6, or 7 years old, and to understand that, it's not about having just leverage with them, but don't continue to contribute to whatever's going on until you have a clear picture of what it is. Maybe they just bet it one time, but why would they go ahead and do that? And what are the parameters that we need going forward? You might identify that it's not a chronic problem, but you don't want to, if example I was using, if I earned money over a 20-year period and took it to a financial advisor and gave him all the money, and, um, you know, 4 months later, he called me back and said, all your money's gone. So then I work for another 20 years, save a bunch of money. I go back to the same financial advisor. And 4 months later, he says, all my money's gone. I mean, how many times am I going to go back to him? I wouldn't have probably gone back the first time. So, we don't want to just look at some of these things and go like, I should just keep supporting them in the way that they need to be supported. I want to support my son or daughter, but what's the best way we're going to find solution that's safe and beneficial to the whole family without continuing the cycle.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people also, whatever the behaviors are, whatever the substance that they're using, whether it is alcohol or marijuana or if it's gambling or gaming, like I think that there's a lot of families out there that do feel like it's that person's challenge and issue. Like they don't necessarily see it as an entire family situation, right? Like it's shameful. There's something wrong with him or her. And, I wish people openly discussed more that, this affects everyone in the family unit. And I know, as we had a son in treatment a few times, that we always were guided to look for programs with a great family program, right? And family support was just as critical as his own individual treatment plan.
Yeah, in all of our treatment centers, and for adults or adolescents, but specifically in adolescents, the family is the client too. It's we do a lot of family work, not to blame the family, but to understand, what are the systemic challenges and what are the systemic solutions. I mean, especially with kids, they're going to go back in the home. And for that parent that says it's their problem, well, if it was really their problem, you wouldn't be feeling the way that you're feeling about it. If you're carrying shame, you're the one carrying the shame. Like, and how is that gonna help? And a lot of this needs education. It's not about, we don't get a lot of parenting. There's a lot of parenting books out there, right? But we don't get a lot of instructions on the specific child that we're dealing with. In fact, we tend to parent exactly like our parents did, or exactly the opposite. And then there's another parent involved, and sometimes multiple parents involved if the family split. So
Yep.
there's a lot going on that we want to discover. Not to, we don't want it to be, it's we're calling it a problem, but the person is not a problem. They're dealing with problematic behaviors. And what is it that's driving them to get to that place? And sometimes it just is they learned it from kids in school. Sometimes it's just a social experiment. But if that social experiment starts to become all consuming, then there's an issue to work with. Like I said, I started off, not everybody that drinks is an alcoholic. It's but if and not everybody that comes to treatment for alcoholism is necessarily an alcoholic. They may have drank problematically for a while. Now, should they leave right away and start drinking or start smoking marijuana and use things that, maybe alter their thinking in a way that they forget the stuff that they just learned, and they get out of the program that was set up, the discharge plan that was set up for them, or the family's discharge plan that was set up for them to kind of move forward? It's hard in many ways. It's hard being a human, and it's definitely hard being a teen, especially in today's world where you see so much of the world that's happening, and you can compare yourself to almost the entire planet rather than just comparing yourselves to the kids in school. And, you know, uh, the, the parents don't necessarily have a frame of reference for that because they didn't grow up in it either, and we'll look at it and go, well, it's social media. Well, maybe it's not always social media. Maybe it's the parents' engagement in social media that's having a problem with it because they're not as present as they were. Maybe it's the whole family and the way that they look at it. I
It's
mean,
a great point.
it's we're quick to find the thing that's outside of us that's causing the problem, and if we just got rid of it. So if we keep saying social media is the problem, we keep saying gambling, but I don't know that it's going anywhere, right? And if we wait until we cut all that out for everybody to be okay, then we're gonna have a problem. We're gonna have more problems than we do now. So with any sort of addiction, the question I always ask folks is, do you have it or does it have you? And that may change at different points. I mean, I always say, sometimes I'm sick in bed and I'm binge watching Netflix because I can't go anywhere and I'm just trying to rest. I can't even read a book because I'm so sick. And other times, I had a really stressful day. Things weren't going the way I wanted. I'm sad. And I find myself binge watching Netflix and staying up too late to the point that I don't get enough sleep to function the next day. Now, is that a huge problem? Probably not if I do it once, but to recognize and understand, at that moment, Netflix had me. I didn't have it. And that's not Netflix's problem,
I love that analogy.
you know? And I think that's the case, oftentimes it's also the question is, all right, you have a problem. Now let's stop. If you can stop for 30 days, great. But what happens if you stop for 30 days and all you're doing is obsessing about it, If your kid is playing video games for 12 hours a day and won't stop, they're finding ways to get it, even if you take it away and shut off the internet and do all this stuff. And then finally you find a way to stop. I bet in your first week that they're not on it, you're gonna wish they were on it because they're begging you for it. They're being very impulsive. Maybe they can't sleep. There's other disturbances, and that can be with something as simple as a video game. If people can stop drinking and stay stopped, then, maybe it wasn't as huge of a problem. Maybe they shouldn't go back to it, but they can stop. But the problem is when people keep picking it back up in the face of all of these challenges that they're experiencing.
Is there one key factor to a person's success for overcoming their addiction or their addictive behavior that helps them from relapsing? Is there one something, or is it a multitude of factors?
I think it's a multitude of factors. And, especially when we treat kids, we have to maybe not look at it as binary. It's the same with adults that like they're either sober or they're not. I mean, it would be great if people stayed abstinent from the things that hurt them forever. But, y- you know, we find often with the kids, we're planting a lot of seeds, and it's hard to tell a 14-year-old kid that they're never going to be able to drink again, and because they see what happens in the world and they might want it just doesn't it rarely works to be like, you're never going to do this again. Like this is where we, in a lot of the 12-step programs, we'll talk about a day at a time. We're breaking it down and living, how are we going to deal with our condition today? And if they do relapse, how quickly do they get back? I think recovery as a process is really learning to be able to recognize when you're, I'm just going to choose the word peace, when you're out of peace sooner and be able to return to it quicker, or when you're out of balance sooner and be able to return to it quicker. You're recovering, and I think there's probably, it's different for different people, but social connection is a very important part of it. That people can feel like they're part of something and they don't feel like they're alone. That's why there's success in a lot of the 12-step programs or other support groups that are out there, because people become part of something and they become useful to each other. You know, a lot of people that come into treatment, the kids included, they feel like they're useless. They feel full of shame and guilt and regret. And so we want to work with them to be able to kind of, you know, to recognize what is, there are things like shame is not a inappropriate emotion at times. If I said something to offend one of you and I didn't realize I did it and I found out I did, like I want to feel a little bit of energy and bad enough to go to you and say, Carrie or Jessica, like, I'm really sorry that happened. Is there anything I can do to make it right? But if I'm walking around just feeling about like shame for who I am, it's like an existential shame. And oftentimes when we're left to our own devices, when we're all alone, when we're isolating, it's just as human beings in general, we're gonna that's gonna be kind of the stuff we're thrown to, and the kind of historical patterns are gonna start to drive us. So when people can really start to understand what their patterns are that drive them, they can understand what creates stressors for them. It's not to avoid all stressors, but to understand, I say this to people all the time, great things cause stress. If we're going on vacation or I have 3 parties to go to on a Saturday that I really want to go to, at the end of the day, I'm probably not going to be, full in my tank to be like the best version of myself. I got to watch that and be like, today I might need to take a rest, to understand and not just, this happens to me all the time. I'll be like, I'm coming home from work. It's the weekend. I love my family. I love spending time with my family. It's going to be a great weekend. Well, I got 17-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. They don't always, and my wife, who might be having her own experience, right? So, it doesn't always go. Sometimes I'm like, thank God it's Monday, because I can go back to and relax a little bit, and I'm sure they feel the same way. But to understand that, these are certain things that are going to cause me stress, and not to run away from fear, but being able to lean into it. And, I think if people, I'm kind of dancing around your question a bit. I think if people can really build a distress tolerance, or we can help them build a distress tolerance to experience the negative emotions that they experience in life, and not all emotions are negative, but the ones that we label as negative, fear, horror, guilt, shame, if they can experience those and tolerate them in a way that they don't have to impulsively react to then go do a behavior that's going to hurt them or others, even if it's hurting them or others over time, then that's a great success. And I think that's the type of thing that really helps people stay in recovery and stay on a healing path. And in order to do that, we have to rely on things just outside of ourselves. We rely on others, we rely on the groups and the support groups that we're part of, we rely on friendships that we build. And I think that's one of the key factors, or some of the key factors for people who succeed in recovery. First, to know themselves. Secondly, to be able to be part of something and be useful to others.
That makes a lot of sense.
Whew. I think sometimes I feel well educated on the subject, and other times I'm like, wow, that was a lot. I just learned so much more. So we really appreciate your time. I feel like we could go on and keep coming up with more and more questions, but we want to respect your time and obviously our listeners' time, because I know people can only take so much at a certain time. So maybe we'll come back and revisit you again when with other topics. But
Dive into more about like what trauma is and
yeah,
how we recognize it. And, that's another,
that would be
that's
a
really
great
what I'm
topic.
looking at with folks. It's not just experiences that they have, but the things that, well, it's not just event based experiences, the things that we experience in life that shape us such that we deal with life in the way that we do. I would love to come back and talk to you guys about that. And I hope today was helpful and I'm
Yeah,
great.
it was, Ryan. Thank you so much
Super,
for being with
super.
us.
So if someone wants to reach out to you, how is the best way? Through us and we'll forward your info, or is there direct line that you would be okay with sharing with anybody?
Sure, they can reach me. They can go to our website, guardianrecovery.com, if they're looking for treatment or help like that for adults or adolescents, whether it's substance use, alcohol use, or primary mental health conditions. Or they can reach me at ryan.swab@grncare.com. And I'm happy to have you put that in the
Or
In our show
show.
notes. Yep.
yeah, we'll add those links. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to this episode of Parent Coaches Unleashed with Carrie and Jessica. Together, we can raise the next generation of independent, capable, and compassionate young adults.
We encourage you to send us an email with questions and feedback to info@parentcoachesunleashed.com. Please remember, you are not alone on this parenting journey.